Found mostly in movies, myths, and legends, there are few magic wielders as elusive as the wizard. Magicians, witches, and warlocks have taken their place in our mundane world, but the wizard exists mostly within the realm of story. With influences from the printed page to the silver screen, the Wizard's Tarot is an imaginative synthesis of fantasy literature, pop culture, and traditional tarot. In this special adventure, deck creator Barbara Moore shares with us the literary influences and personal musings that weave their way through the enchanting world of the Wizard's Tarot. As Barbara writes in the guidebook, tarot is a journey into wisdom, so let the journey begin. Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today we'll be taking a stroll through the magical world of the Wizard's Tarot with commentary by creator Barbara Moore. We begin our journey with the innocent soul of the Fool at the crossroads of a decision. While we most often see the Fool falling into their destiny, Barbara has chosen a more intentional representation to begin our journey. Here our Fool is consciously choosing to make that leap. A synthesis of every wizard gathering his power, the magician represents the embodiment of that will. Known to us as the ego, the magician is the part of us that wants to manifest and express ourselves in this world.
This image is inspired by all the wizards who took on terrible enemies, such as Dumbledore facing Voldemort, Gandalf facing Saruman, and Alice facing the Beast.
These are the moments when we draw energy within to create change around us. The High Priestess stands at the threshold of initiation. She is intuition, the part of us that remembers our divine connection and silently speaks from this place of inner truth. Like Persephone, who travels between the worlds, we can't know what to expect until we find ourselves standing at the gateway, ready to listen. As Demeter, the mother of Persephone, held the world in winter until her daughter returned, the Empress represents inherent power and inevitable change. She is the Great Mother, the earth and the ruler of the wheel of life. She reminds us that we have the honor and the responsibility to create and nurture abundance. As the companion to the Empress, we find the archetype of the Great Father in the Emperor. A challenging card for many people as he comes from a place of authority, the Emperor reminds us of our own responsibilities. A card generally draped in religious trappings, Barbara reminds us that the Hierophant is not bound to tradition, but is the archetype of the teacher.
This Hierophant is a synthesis of all the teachers at all the magical schools. His clothes may be over the top compared to some, such as Dean Fogg, who was always stylishly clad, but he'd sure fit right in with some of the Hogwarts teachers.
His purpose is to cultivate a space for you to gain clarity of your values and shape your beliefs. The Lover's card has long been associated with romantic inclinations. Here we see the lovers represented not just as a union of individuals, but as the alchemical marriage.
This Lover's card explores the Arbor Diana, a magical creation featured in the All Souls trilogy by Deborah Harkness. It is a tree resulting from an alchemical process. In some literature, it represents a new level of life and transformation. The Arbor Diana also appears in the Judgment card and in the Three of Pentacles.
This Lovers reminds us to make choices that align with our core values and make us feel complete. The Chariot, as a culmination of the lessons gained in the first few cards, prepares us to face the challenges to come. This card holds the symbols of all the cards that came before it: Lotus, Dragon, Stars, Pillars, Union of the Sun and Moon, and a reminder that we take these with us as we venture forward.
Although during the creation of this deck, I didn't consciously think of this, but looking at it now, I think of Harry Potter facing the dragon during the Triwizard Tournament. It doesn't illustrate the scene, but it does show what went on symbolically. Harry had to marshal all his skills, control his fears, and think intelligently in order to survive. Anyone taking up the reins of the chariot needs all of that to maintain control of the power they're attempting to direct.
In Strength, we face one of the most difficult challenges of all, the acceptance, forgiveness, and healing of self. The dragon in this card represents the shadow, and although it was not Barbara's initial intention, I see in her the mother of dragons.
I didn't know who Daenerys was until I heard Dawn Michelle mention her in an earlier video. I looked her up, and yes, she absolutely could be the model for this card. I read a little about her character, about how she was initially timid, but gathered confidence, eventually becoming a formidable conqueror and ruler.
I agree with Barbara wholeheartedly. Both Daenerys' character and the symbol of the dragon itself creates the perfect representation for the archetype of strength.
Another interesting thing about this card is that it was Mika's first sample card and the one that landed her the job.
As we journey through the major arcana, let's take a brief moment to talk about influences and tarot and symbols.
This deck has few deliberate illustrations of specific characters or scenes. However, even though every card isn't deliberately connected to something specific, and nor should it be, in my opinion, every card is influenced by the collective body of fantasy that has crossed my path. That's why me seeing a connection to Harry Potter and the Chariot that I didn't intentionally include, and Dawn Michelle seeing Daenerys, is bound to happen. I think synthesized ideas or composite ideas are more effective than specific ones, because if an image is too specific, the reader may feel they need to be super familiar with whatever book or series is being referred to.
Speaking of personal associations, in The Hermit I find Gandalf, because for me, that ties into my understanding of the archetype of the hermit and my personal association with that particular character. In the guidebook, Barbara also writes that the hermit is a call to find your authentic self, and you can't find it through the eyes of others. I think that is one of the best descriptions of the hermit card that I've ever read. The Wheel of Fortune makes my nerdy heart happy. As Barbara states, it's a shift from the traditional Wheel of the Year imagery we often see in witchy or pagan decks to incorporate the alchemical energy of the world of the wizard.
The outer edge represents chaos theory and fractals. The 4 main rings are the 4 classical elements. The white one is water, represented by snowflakes, which is, of course, frozen water. Green is earth, with growing vines. Yellow is air and features astrological symbols. Red is fire, with runes spelling out abracadabra. In the center is the pentacle, the symbol of all the elements in service to spirit and under your control. I know most actual practitioners of modern magic say this, but as for literary character sources, this is exactly what Harry Dresden believes about the symbolic significance of the pentacle, and that is the intentional connection here. The source of the wizard's control is the center of the wheel, a metaphor for one's inner central core of belief and will. The elemental middle rings can be within the wizard's control and influence. The chaotic outer ring represents external circumstances that must be reacted or responded to.
I love the reinvention of the wheel through this alchemical lens. For me, it feels like the space where the magic and the mundane meet, where fantasy becomes reality and reality folds back into fantasy. In Justice, we find an empty chair and scales perfectly in balance. In the book, Barbara notes that without a human presence in the imagery, this card offers more of a commentary on universal justice rather than personal karma. As an archetype in the major arcana, viewing it through the lens of the macrocosm makes perfect sense. What I love about this card is the openness to interpretation. Personally, I see it as an invitation to sit down and weigh my options. In the Hanged Man, we are often called to embrace a shift in perspective. But like the hangman himself, Barbara offers us a different idea.
This hanged man isn't a specific reference, but a generalized observation. This and many other cards in this deck feature books, which are important sources of knowledge and power for wizards. In this card, being separated from the library is symbolic, especially for wizards who value study so highly. We know the hanged man can be a traitor and consequently banned from the library, or a martyr who makes it impossible for themselves to enjoy the library, or someone who sacrifices for wisdom. This hanged man set aside his familiar world of the written word to give himself over to nature in search for a transformational experience.
In the tarot, we often view death not as a termination, but a transformation.
Based on early feedback, the initial intent doesn't seem to have come across quite as I'd hoped. In this image, death is the woman, and the man is the one who died. He is in the process of becoming the phoenix rising from the flame as he dances with death. One could easily think of Harry Potter, who died but didn't in the last book, and Harry Dresden, who died in Ghost Story but then didn't. And, of course, Dumbledore's phoenix, Fawkes.
For me, tapping back into that blending of collective imagery with personal associations, I see my beloved Buffy and Angel in this image. With Barbara's notes in mind, I see Buffy as Death herself, the vampire slayer. Angel is the vampire, the one who has died. It is through their love that he is able to rise from the flames of his eternal existence. Although I have to say that personally, I was always rooting for Spike. Within the cocoon of death, we dissolve into the melding of temperance, where it is time to mix and merge into something new. Temperance is a card of balance, of control and moderation, and we see that represented here beautifully in this image of temperance. The devil is a challenging card for many, and as Barbara states in the book, he brings us face to face with our worst fears and our most troubling thoughts and behaviors. To confront the devil is to confront the worst in ourselves, the worst in humanity, and this can be one of the hardest challenges we face. I love that in this card, each human figure has a wand, and if they wanted, they could set fire to that stack of books the devil is perched on. Perhaps in this card, we are also reminded that knowledge is power. It can be used to serve, or it can be used to destroy. The underlying message may also be, consider carefully how you use that knowledge. More dreadful than death, more frightening than the devil, the Tower is the one card that can strike true fear into the heart of every tarot reader. Okay, so maybe that's a little bit dramatic, but the Tower is definitely considered another one of those challenging cards. But with the Tower comes change and the opportunity to rebuild. Though no specific reference is made to this card, the wintry scene reminds me of the Wall and the home in the Night Watch of the Game of Thrones. The wall had to fall because winter is coming. Sorry, I just couldn't resist. The star brings hope, healing, and serenity after the fall of the tower. Although it's not necessarily wizardy, I see the goddess in this image, the divine feminine that brings healing to the world after all the destruction. She offers us the opportunity to rest and heal before we complete our journey. An often romanticized card, the moon in the Wizard's Tarot reminds us that the moon illuminates as much as it shadows. Here we see their larger-than-life lobster guarding his towers. He represents our deepest fears emerging from the subconscious. This card brings to mind every monster movie I ever saw as a kid. Like the Godzilla of Tarot, this lobster reminds us that things aren't always as they seem. This Sun card, usually one of my least liked cards in a deck, is actually one of my favorites. A card of happiness, joy, and success, this card reminds us that after this journey, we now know exactly who we are and where we are going. Again, going back to those personal associations, although I have no literary or movie ties to this card, it reminds me of my childhood dreams and the fantasy worlds I engaged in during my youth. Judgment brings us back to the Arbor Diana. In the guidebook, Barbara also writes that the books are the coffins that hold the dead, that they were bound by the pages they studied, but are now invited to transmute abstraction and theories into life.
The Judgment card explores how the alchemical process brings renewed life.
As we reach the World card, we achieve success in our quest. As Barbara mentions in the guidebook, in wizardly terms, we've completed the cycle of individuation and reintegration. We step into our authentic self. And looking at this card through a fantasy lens, with my own personal associations thrown in, of course, I see every princess who has ever struggled to shake the stereotypes that bind her and step into a story of her own making. Now that we've taken a look at the complete Major Arcana, I just want to point out a few of my favorite cards in the Major Arcana. I do quite like the Empress. She feels very much like the queen who's manifesting her kingdom in a way that is alignment with her authentic self, and I think that's really wonderful. I do quite like the Lovers with the alchemical marriage. I think that's a beautiful card. Strength, of course, one of my favorite cards in this deck because it is Daenerys, and I just think that's wonderful. Love the Hermit. Very Gandalf, as I mentioned. I really do like this Justice card. It's one of my favorites in the deck because of the openness of it, and I think it really allows you to look at things the way you want to. I also really like this Death card because, as I said, I see Buffy and Angel in it, and that's just fun. I also quite like this Devil because I like the fact that he's stacked up on all these books. And as I mentioned, you know, I feel like they could light those books on fire and he would be in trouble. This Moon card was one that I kind of struggled with at first because it's a really unromanticized look at the moon, but I quite like how the lobster is really larger than life in this particular Moon card, and I think it's a really interesting interpretation, so I do actually quite like it. As I mentioned, the Sun card is one of my favorites. I think it's just beautiful, and I do love in Judgment how they're all coming out of these book-like coffins. I think that's really wonderful. The Minor Arcana in the Wizard's Tarot explores the mundane of human life through the stories of the magical wizard. As the guidebook groups these cards by number, we'll follow along with their progression. Here we have our aces. Our aces are new beginnings, gift, or opportunity filled with potential. Here we see the Ace of Wands, which is fire, will, and passion. Next we have our Eights of Cups for water, soul, and emotions. Here we see our Ace of Swords representing air, mind, and communication. And finally, we have our Ace of Pentacles for earth, the physical, and manifestation. Our twos are about choices and decisions. So here we have our Two of Wands, our Two of Cups, our Two of Swords.
Although more sci-fi than fantasy, there are some mystical elements to the TV show Firefly and the movie Serenity. In particular, the character River Tam has intense but chaotic psychic experiences. This card is inspired by River's role at the end of Serenity, where she decides to take action even though the odds are insurmountable. The way she moves in that scene reminds me of how my mind feels when I'm in a Two of Swords situation.
And our Two of Pentacles. Next, we have our threes, and threes are about synthesis and growth and are a mini completion on the journey to the tens. So we begin with our Three of Wands.
The Three of Wands reminds me of waiting for Polyjuice potion to mature.
Our Three of Cups. Our Three of Swords.
The Three of Swords is that moment when any wizard realizes the answer they seek doesn't exist. For example, Harry Dresden looking for a cure for Susan's vampirism.
And finally, our Three of Pentacles. Moving on, we have our fours, and fours act as a container, like a square box holding the essence of each suit. As Barbara reminds us in the guidebook, not all energy does well in a stable environment, and it can turn stagnant. So here we have our Four of Wands.
Portals and doors are common in magical stories, such as in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and The Magicians. Secret doorways play a role in Harry Potter. The characters in the Dresden Files often cut portals between the real world and the Never Never or Fairy. Since working on this project, I've also read The Starless Sea, which has magical doors. I'm currently reading The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex Harrow, and it is all about magical doors. In most of these stories, the doors exist only temporarily or only operate at certain times. The Four of Wands, marking a temporary moment of completion, was the perfect card for the magical portals so common in the literature.
Our Four of Cups.
The Four of Cups reminds me of Penny in The Magicians not wanting to be a teacher.
Our Four of Swords. And our Four of Pentacles. And here we have our fives. The fives are chaotic, bringing movement to a stagnant situation or exacerbating an already confused one. They can either create new problems or, if we're lucky, bring fresh solutions. So here we have our Five of Wands.
The Five of Wands is quite simply magical dueling, something that almost all our favorite wizards face sometime or another.
Our Five of Cups.
The Five of Cups and the Knight of Pentacles are inspired by the clock trees created by the Watcher Woman in the Magicians trilogy. The Five of Cups brings to mind the old tradition of stopping clocks when someone dies, and also the idea that we must take the time to mourn, but then the time of mourning ends and normal life is resumed. The Knight of Pentacles, he knows all about the importance of time and timing, both as a resource and as a strategy. And that's why the clock tree appears in his card too.
Our Five of Swords.
The Five of Swords reminds me of the scene at the center of the maze in Goblet of Fire, where Harry is bound, Cedric is dead nearby, and the evil folks are making some bad mistakes that they will regret later. Although for now, they seem to have won.
And our Five of Pentacles.
The Five of Pentacles is a symbol for any kid who wanted to go to magical school but couldn't, like Petunia Dursley or Julia Wicker.
Where the fives upset the stability of the fours, the sixes reestablish normalcy. Here we have our Six of Wands, our Six of Cups, our Six of Swords.
The Six of Swords was definitely influenced by Sirius's motorbike from Harry Potter.
And our Six of Pentacles. Oh, here we have our sevens, and the sevens bring the energy of assessment to the forefront. Here we have our Seven of Wands, our Seven of Cups.
The Seven of Cups reminds me of Hermione facing the riddle of the potions in the Sorcerer's Stone.
Our Seven of Swords.
The Seven of Swords represents the long history of wizards stealing books or having books stolen from them, such as Ashmole 782 in the All Souls trilogy, any book from the restricted section at Hogwarts, or from the Poison Room at the Library of the Netherlands.
And our Seven of Pentacles.
The Seven of Pentacles is any magician crafting their own tools. Harry Dresden does a lot of magical tool crafting with the help of his spirit of intellect assistant called Bob the Skull, who is sitting on the shelf in this image.
Our eights are filled with power, which usually propels you forward with great speed. But if that power isn't channeled, it can become a loop and a trap. Here we have our Eight of Wands.
The Eight of Wands is any spell being released by any wizard.
Our Eight of Cups, our Eight of Swords, and our Eight of Pentacles. Nines are the cards of solitude and fullness. Each one brings a situation you must work through alone, which will shape your identity and who you will become. Here we have the Nine of Wands.
The Nine of Wands honors one of my favorite wizards of all time, Harry Dresden.
Our Nine of Cups, Nine of Swords, and our Nine of Pentacles. The tens tell the stories of completion, fulfillment, and excess. They are sometimes the realization of the ace's potential and sometimes a warning of too much of a good thing. Here we have our Ten of Wands, our Ten of Cups, our Ten of Swords, and our Ten of Pentacles.
Although the child is female in this Ten of Pentacles, it reminds me of Lily and James Potter. Maybe that is Dumbledore in the background, a spiritual and magical grandfather figure.
As we move through the numbered minors, we are reminded that they serve as the plot and setting for our everyday lives. In the court of the Wizard's Tarot, we find the people who make those stories come alive.
One of my favorite things about tarot is its structure. The structure for the court cards is influenced by the Dresden Files, because this is how magic works in that world. But it is not unique to it. It is similar to what many actual modern practitioners believe too.
Pages have the characters of youth and are about learning something.
Pages, being of earth, represent preparation, which is the key to most wizardly success. In the images, part of their preparation is being fully immersed in their element and working with their tools.
The knights are very action-focused with a lot of energy, some experience, and plenty of opinions.
Knights, being of fire, represent the will of the wizard, necessary for directing power. The horses symbolize the wizard's relationship with their will. How the knights handle their horse shows the various ways wizards can focus and control their will.
Queens are often the teachers or mentors and are there to offer their support.
Queens, being of water, represent the emotions, which are an important source of magical power. Queens are also intuitive, and their animal companions represent their connection with other realms of knowing. The Queen of Wands has a black cat, the Queen of Cups a turtle, the Queen of Swords an owl, and the Queen of Pentacles a rabbit.
And finally, our kings focus on the big picture and enlist their experience and authority.
Kings, being of air, represent learned skills and knowledge.
Now that we've had a look through the minor arcana, I just want to point out some of my favorite cards in the deck. I do quite like all of the aces in this deck because they really embody their elemental energy, and I think that's really wonderful. Now that I've spoken with Barbara about this deck, and now when I see this Two of Swords, I think of River Tam, and that for me is just such a wonderful association that this really is one of my favorite cards in the deck. Now, I do often like the Two of Swords anyway, but this one, having that correlation back to a series that really was quite wonderful and very meaningful for me, I really do enjoy that association to that card now. I love this Three of Swords because, as we know, if you've watched any of my other walkthroughs, I don't read the Three of Swords as heartbreak. For me, that's a Five of Cups energy, and I love the idea of all of this kind of mental chaos that we see going on in this card, and I think that's really beautiful, and I love this depiction of it because it really falls in line with how I actually read the Three of Swords. So I see the Three of Swords as the growth of the mind, and to me this card really depicts that. It kind of depicts a little bit of the darker side of that because sometimes, you know, growing your thoughts, growing your beliefs can be tricky, it can be conflicting, and so I think this card really depicts that beautifully. This Four of Cups and I have a little bit of a history, so I'm quite fond of it. When I asked this deck, when I did a deck interview and I asked this deck how it felt about being brought into my collection, this was the card I got, and it was just a really wonderful, fun experience in that reading overall. So every time I see this Four of Cup, it makes me think of that initial reading that I did with this deck, and it really is just kind of a wonderful, playful association for me. And for me, this card really kind of embodies the energy of this deck for me, which is quite playful. It's a very fun deck, very playful deck, and it has a wonderful energy to it. I do also quite like this Four of Swords because I love this idea of the rest. It's a very Sleeping Beauty type of energy, which I think is really wonderful. I do quite like this Four of Pentacles too, because rather than the sort of misering of resources, we get this idea of being locked behind the door, and that can be a safety thing or that can be a restrictive thing, and I think it largely depends on the context of the reading, but I quite like that. I think this Five of Cups is really beautiful, and I love it connecting back to the clock tree. This card for me, the Six of Pentacles, it reminds me of Alice from The Magicians, and I kind of have that association with her for this card now, which is really a fun one to have, I think. I really quite like the Seven of Swords too, because although we do kind of have a little bit of that thiefy energy, I don't think you necessarily have to read it that way. Maybe he's just accumulating all the knowledge, right? If we think of seven in terms of 3 plus 4 is the growth of the 3 plus the stability of the 4, we get that idea of growing of knowledge, and it can be not necessarily a bad sort of thiefy energy. Maybe he's not necessarily stealing the books. Maybe he's just taking them because he's learned all that he needs to know, or this is what he has left to study. And I think that's really wonderful. I love the openness of it. I love this Eight of Swords because we can see here the sword is just like all she has to do is open her hand and she can take that sword and free herself. And I think that's a really wonderful depiction of that card. I do also quite like this Ten of Swords, and although I tend to struggle some with the sword suits in some decks, this card to me, like, this is Superman, right? He's got his red cape on, he's got all the swords in his back. Maybe there were painful lessons to learn, but he's gonna move on from this. He's gonna take it to the next level. He's gonna learn his lessons and move on, and I actually quite like that depiction. I also quite like this Knight of Swords. I just think she looks beautiful on her horse. She looks very powerful. She's definitely going to go out there and like slay her demons, right? She's off on the adventure. She's going to speak her truth, and I think that that's really wonderful. So overall, a really lovely minor arcana as well. And like I said, I really enjoy the playful energy and the playful nature of this deck. It's been a lot of fun to get to know and to work with. The Wizard's Tarot is a wonderfully imaginative and creative journey through the 78 cards of the Major Arcana. While I love the fantasy imagery of the cards and the memories, scenes, and personal associations those images stir, what I appreciate most about these cards is Barbara's numerological approach to the deck. I've often said in many videos, reviews, and walkthroughs that my own personal reading style leans more to the numerological and elemental rather than the traditional RWS structure of the tarot. This deck beautifully blends all those associations together into a tarot that holds true to an RWS structure but isn't restricted by it. The imagery and certainly Barbara's writings in the book leave plenty of room for people like me who read a little bit differently. And speaking of the talented Barbara Moore, I'd like to just take a moment to thank her for letting me peek into her world and sharing with us her literary influences and personal musings on the Wizard's Tarot.
Dawn Michelle, thank you so much for letting me be part of this project. It really was a lot of fun, and I hope that your viewers enjoy it as well.
There is so much to discover within this beautiful deck and its accompanying guidebook. Barbara and I invite you to explore its magical realms, find your favorite associations, create your own beautiful connections, and dive deep into the wisdom of the Wizard's Tarot. I hope you enjoyed this video and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.